If you're listening to this, there's a strong chance you've always known you were different. Not superior, not chosen, just different in a way you never had language for. You felt things before others noticed them. You sensed shifts in rooms before words were spoken. You absorbed emotions that were never yours and carried them as if they were a debt you owed the world. And somewhere along the way, you learned a dangerous lesson that your depth was something to hide, that your sensitivity was something to manage, that your intuition was something to doubt. This story is not about weakness. It's about why the most perceptive souls are almost always pulled into the orbit of the most destructive ones, and why that collision was never accidental. If you're still listening, it means some part of you already knows this isn't just psychology. It's initiation. The first wound when seeing too much became a liability. You didn't become an empath because you were gentle. You became one because, at some point early in life, it was safer to read the room than to exist freely inside it. You learned to scan faces, to anticipate moods, to predict emotional weather patterns before storms could break. Not because you wanted power, but because unpredictability once meant pain. So you adapted. You sharpened perception. You softened your edges. You learned to feel for others so you wouldn't have to feel from them. And this adaptation worked. Until it didn't. Because the same skill that made you emotionally intelligent also made you visible to predators who live on reflection. The narcissist does not find you by chance. They find you because you glow in the dark places they refuse to explore. If you're still listening, it means this dynamic already feels uncomfortably familiar. The mask that searches for a mirror, the narcissist, does not experience themselves as hollow. They experience themselves as unfinished. There is a gap inside them, not an emptiness, but a missing center. And instead of turning inward to face it, they turn outward to borrow one. This is where you come in. Your empathy becomes their mirror. Your attunement becomes their validation. Your ability to see beneath masks becomes the very thing they weaponize. At first, it feels intoxicating. They say things no one has ever said to you before. They see you, or at least, they seem to. They reflect back a version of yourself that feels powerful, meaningful, finally recognized. But what you don't realize yet is this: they aren't seeing you. They are studying what you respond to. If you're still listening, pause for a moment and notice how your chest reacts to that sentence. The seduction phase, when depth feels like destiny, the bond forms quickly because it bypasses logic. It speaks directly to the unhealed part of you that learned early on that love requires vigilance. You feel knighted, chosen, singled out, and on a soul level, something whispers finally, someone who can meet me at my depth. But this is the illusion. Because the narcissist does not descend into depth, they extract it. They mirror your intensity, not because they possess it, but because they need access to it. And the tragedy is this: your empathy fills the space where their self should be. If you're still listening, it means you've felt the confusion of giving more and feeling less. The slow erosion when light becomes a resource. The shift is subtle. It always is. A comment here, a withdrawal there, a look that makes you question your memory. Your intuition senses something is wrong, but your empathy explains it away. They are stressed. They are wounded. They've never been loved properly. And without realizing it, you step into a role you were trained for long before this relationship ever began: the emotional regulator. You absorb their chaos. You stabilize their image. You carry the weight they refuse to feel. And slowly, imperceptibly, your inner world begins to dim. Not because you're weak, but because light cannot survive indefinitely in a vacuum that never gives back. If you're still listening, it means you recognize the exhaustion that never quite goes away. The shadow awakens when pain becomes a signal. There comes a moment, often late at night, when the pain stops feeling random. When something inside you asks a forbidden question: why am I the one always explaining, forgiving, understanding, and breaking. This question marks the beginning of shadow awareness. Not the shadow as darkness, but as everything you were never allowed to claim. Your anger, your boundaries, your instinct to live. The narcissist senses this shift immediately, because your awakening threatens the arrangement. And so the pressure increases. Gaslighting sharpens. Affection becomes conditional. Silence becomes punishment. This is not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It is desperation. Because the moment you reclaim your shadow, their borrowed self begins to collapse. If you're still listening, something inside you is already remembering who you were before you learned to disappear. The realization you were never meant to stay here is the truth that changes everything. You were never meant to heal the narcissist. You were meant to outgrow the version of yourself that believed love required self-erasure. The relationship was not a failure. It was a mirror brutal enough to force individuation, to push you toward a self that no longer survives by attunement alone, but stands rooted in inner authority. This is where fear intensifies. Because leaving does not just mean losing them. It means losing the identity that formed around managing others' emotions. If you're still listening, it means you're standing at the edge of that loss now. Soft cliffhanger, the door you haven't opened, yet there is a stage beyond awareness, beyond pain, beyond understanding. A stage where empathy is no longer a vulnerability, but a conscious force aligned with boundaries, shadow, and self-trust. But to reach it, something must be confronted. Not the narcissist, not the past, but the part of you that learned to confuse intensity with intimacy, and endurance with love. In the next part, we will descend into that confrontation, into the moment where the empath stops orbiting other psyches and begins forming a center of their own. If you're still listening, it means you're ready to step through the mirror. If you're still listening, it means something inside you has already begun to loosen its grip on the old story. Not because it stopped hurting, but because the pain has changed texture. It no longer feels like chaos. It feels like a signal. The moment empathy turns inward, there is a precise moment in every empath-narcissist entanglement when the psyche shifts direction. It does not happen during the love bombing. It does not happen during the discard. It happens quietly, often after the relationship has technically ended, but psychologically refuses to release you. You wake up one morning and realize you are no longer asking why they did what they did. You are asking why you stayed so long explaining yourself to someone who never listened. This question is dangerous because it threatens the identity you built around being the one who understands. For most of your life, empathy was not just a trait, it was a survival strategy. You learned that harmony meant safety, that emotional fluency meant control, that anticipating others meant avoiding abandonment. And now, that strategy has turned against you. If you're still listening, notice how this realization doesn't feel like shame, it feels like clarity. The shadow is not what you think it is. The shadow is not your darkness. It is your disowned authority. It is everything you learned to suppress because it made others uncomfortable, your anger when boundaries were crossed, your intuition when something felt wrong, your instinct to withdraw when respect vanished. You were not punished for being cruel. You were punished for being accurate. So you adapted. You softened truth. You delayed exits. You rationalized behavior that your nervous system recognized instantly. The narcissist exploited this adaptation not because they are clever, but because your shadow had not yet been reclaimed. They lived where your boundaries should have been. If you're still listening, something inside you is starting to feel less confused and more alert. Why the narcissist fears your anger here is something rarely spoken. Aloud, the narcissist does not fear your sadness. They do not fear your forgiveness. They do not even fear your intelligence. They fear your anger. Not rage, not outbursts, but cold, grounded, self-respecting anger. Because that anger is the moment you stop negotiating your worth. It is the moment you no longer ask for understanding and start requiring accountability. And accountability is incompatible with their internal structure. So they pathologize your anger. They call it sensitivity, drama, instability. But what they are really reacting to is this: your shadow is waking up. If you're still listening, feel how different it is to hear anger described as protection instead of poison. The addiction to explanation. Empaths do not get trapped because they are naive. They get trapped because they believe clarity will eventually be reciprocated. You explain your feelings with precision. You articulate emotional nuances. You believe that if you can just say it the right way, something will click. This is the addiction. Explanation becomes hope. Hope becomes endurance. Endurance becomes self-betrayal. And the narcissist unconsciously encourages this cycle. Because as long as you are explaining, you are still invested, still engaged, still available. Silence, on the other hand, terrifies them, because silence means you are no longer feeding the mirror. If you're still listening, you may be realizing how much energy you spent trying to be understood by someone who was only listening for leverage. The turning point from mirror to center shadow integration does not look dramatic from the outside. It looks boring, quiet, almost anticlimactic. You stop responding immediately. You stop correcting their version of events. You stop rehearsing conversations that will never happen. And internally, something radical occurs. Your attention comes home. Instead of tracking their moods, you start tracking your body. Instead of scanning for approval, you listen for alignment. Instead of asking, how do they feel? You ask, what do I need? This is not selfishness. This is individuation. The psyche withdrawing projections and reclaiming energy. If you're still listening, notice how this shift feels less like empowerment and more like relief. The grief no one prepares you for here is the grief most people do not warn you about, not missing them, but missing who you were when you believed love meant limitless patience. There is a mourning period for the self that tried harder, the self that hoped longer, the self that believed depth could save someone who refused to look inward. This grief is necessary, because without it, you will keep searching for the same dynamic in different faces. Shadow integration requires honoring what the old strategy once protected you from and releasing it when it no longer serves you. If you're still listening, allow yourself to feel this grief without turning it into self-judgment. The rare trait you didn't know you had. Not every empath makes it to this stage. Many remain stuck oscillating between compassion and collapse. But those who reach this threshold share a rare psychological trait: they can hold contradiction without dissociation. You can acknowledge your love for someone and recognize they were harmful. You can feel empathy and enforce distance. You can understand trauma without sacrificing yourself to it. This capacity is not common. It is forged, often through relationships that force the psyche to choose between self-awareness and self-erasure. If you're still listening, this may be the first time your endurance feels like intelligence instead of a flaw. Why boundaries feel unnatural at first. Boundaries feel unnatural to empaths because they interrupt a lifelong pattern. You were rewarded for flexibility, praised for patience, loved for understanding. Boundaries threaten those rewards. At first, enforcing them feels like cruelty. You worry you're becoming cold, detached, like the very people who hurt you. But this fear is misplaced. A boundary is not an attack. It is information. It tells the psyche where it ends and where another begins. The narcissist experiences this as abandonment because they rely on enmeshment. You experience it as guilt because you were trained to equate access with love. If you're still listening, notice how boundaries begin to feel less like walls and more like gravity. The internal power shift. There is a moment when the narcissist's voice inside your head begins to fade. Not because you've forgiven them, not because you've understood everything, but because their opinions no longer define your self-evaluation. You stop arguing with ghosts. You stop defending yourself internally. You stop needing them to agree with your reality. This is power, not dominance, not control, but psychological sovereignty, the return of authority to the self. If you're still listening, something inside you already knows this is the freedom you were searching for all along. Soft cliffhanger, the final initiation, there is one final threshold. A stage few empaths reach and fewer understand while they are in it. It is the moment when empathy is no longer reactive, but directed, when intuition is no longer anxious, but anchored, when compassion no longer drains you, but flows through you without depletion. But reaching this stage requires one last confrontation, not with the narcissist, not with the past, but with the fear that without suffering, you might lose your depth. In the final part, we will enter that initiation, the moment where the empath stops surviving relationships and begins choosing them from wholeness. If you're still listening, it means you're ready for that crossing. If you're still listening, it means you've crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Not outwardly, not in a way others immediately notice, but inwardly where the psyche rearranges itself long before life reflects the change. Something fundamental has shifted. And now, the old questions no longer satisfy you. The fear that guards the final door, there is a fear that waits at the final threshold. It is quieter than anxiety, deeper than grief, more unsettling than loneliness. It whispers, if I stop suffering, will I lose my depth? This fear keeps many empaths tethered to pain long after understanding has arrived. Because for years, sometimes decades, pain was not just an experience. It was identity. Your insight was forged through endurance. Your wisdom extracted from wounds. Your meaning shaped by survival. So the psyche hesitates. Who am I without struggle? Who am I without something to heal? Who am I if love no longer hurts? If you're still listening, feel how honest this fear is and how rarely it is named. The myth of the wounded healer, you have been told, directly or indirectly, that your power comes from your wounds, that your empathy exists because of what broke you, that your sensitivity is inseparable from suffering. This is only half true. Pain may have opened the door, but it was never meant to be the house you live in forever. The wounded healer is not someone who bleeds endlessly. They are someone who learned to close the wound without closing the heart. The narcissist represents the distortion of this myth. They remain wounded, but refuse responsibility. You represent its evolution. You felt deeply and chose consciousness over repetition. If you're still listening, something inside you is beginning to loosen its attachment to pain as proof of depth. When empathy stops being reactive, reactive empathy feels like compulsion. You feel first. You absorb first. You respond before choosing. This was necessary once. It kept you safe in unpredictable environments. It allowed you to navigate emotional volatility. It helped you belong. But mature empathy is different. It pauses. It observes. It discerns. It asks permission internally before engaging. You no longer merge automatically. You no longer feel obligated to enter every emotional storm. This is not detachment. This is sovereignty. Empathy with boundaries becomes a force rather than a liability. If you're still listening, notice how this version of empathy feels calmer, almost unfamiliar. The narcissist's final disappearance, there comes a moment when the narcissist truly loses power. Not when you confront them. Not when you expose them. Not when you explain one final time. But when they stop occupying space in your inner world. Their voice fades. Their reactions no longer register as meaningful. Their absence feels neutral rather than devastating. This is not indifference. It is completion. They served their psychological function. They forced the collapse of an identity that could no longer sustain your growth. And now, without drama or ceremony, the psyche releases them. If you're still listening, You may realize that you haven't thought about them in the way you used to, and that realization feels strangely quiet. The formation of the inner center for most of your life. Meaning lived outside you. In connection. In resonance. In being seen through others' eyes. Now, something unprecedented happens. Meaning begins to self-generate. You feel grounded even when alone. Your intuition no longer seeks confirmation. Your emotions inform rather than overwhelm. This is the formation of the inner center, the place from which choices are made, not reactions. From here, relationships are no longer survival structures. They are mirrors of wholeness. If you're still listening, feel how different it is to imagine love without urgency. Why you will never attract the same dynamic again. This is not because you became colder. It is because your nervous system changed its criteria. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. You no longer equate charisma with depth. You no longer mistake attention for attunement. Your body now recognizes coherence. Consistency feels attractive. Emotional availability feels safe. Mutual responsibility feels magnetic. The narcissist thrives on asymmetry. You no longer offer it. If you're still listening, something inside you already senses how different future connections will feel. The loneliness of this stage, few people talk about this. But the final stage of awakening can feel isolating. Not because you are disconnected, but because you can no longer participate in unconscious emotional economies. You see patterns others deny. You feel shifts before they become visible. You sense when dynamics are built on projection rather than presence. This can make superficial connections fall away. But what replaces them is not emptiness. It is space. And space is where authentic bonds form. If you're still listening, trust that this quiet is not absence, it is preparation. The return of joy without chaos, one of the most disorienting experiences for a healed empath, is joy without volatility. No emotional spikes. No dramatic highs. No consuming attachment. Just warmth, curiosity, steady presence. At first, this feels dull, because the nervous system was conditioned to equate chaos with aliveness. But slowly, the psyche recalibrates. Peace stops feeling boring. Stability stops feeling empty. Love stops feeling like work. If you're still listening, allow yourself to imagine a life where joy does not require recovery. The final integration, shadow integration, is complete when you no longer fear your darkness and no longer need it to define you. You can access anger without being consumed by it. You can feel compassion without self-erasure. You can walk away without hatred. This is psychological adulthood. Not perfection, not enlightenment, but wholeness. The empath who reaches this stage does not shine loudly. They radiate quietly. And only those capable of meeting them there will feel it. If you're still listening, something inside you recognizes this as truth, not aspiration. Closing the soul that stands you were never meant to disappear inside other people. You were meant to stand as yourself. Empathy was never your weakness. Sensitivity was never your flaw. Depth was never your curse. They were tools waiting for integration. The narcissist was not your destiny. They were the catalyst, the mirror that shattered just enough to force you inward. And now, you carry something different. Not armor, not detachment, but presence. A presence that no longer bleeds to prove its worth. If you're still listening, it means you've already begun living from that place. And from here, nothing you attract will require you to abandon yourself again.